Benjamin Netanyahu says no to Donald Trump. There's a standoff in the West Bank between the IDF and extremist Jewish settlers. And we'll be taking stock of life in the diaspora as we approach the third anniversary of October the 7th. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London. Yonit is away, but stepping in and stepping up is a former colleague of mine, now columnist at the Sunday Times, author of the acclaimed memoir House of Glass. I'm delighted to welcome onto Unholy Hadley Freeman. Hadley, it's fantastic to have you with us.
Oh, thank you, Johnny. It is a great honor to be here, and certainly not filling Yonit's shoes, but borrowing them for a little bit.
And coming from a former fashion writer, this is quite the statement, because that is actually, I think, am I right in saying that is how you began in this trade of ours as a fashion writer?
That's right. So I started as, well, not even a fashion writer, as a fashion assistant. I was in charge of the all-important fashion cupboard at the Guardian newspaper, and that is how I got started.
Does this mean you are essentially, is it Annie in Devil Wears Prada? Are you basically that character? Andy. Thank you.
The difference between me and Andy is she thought she was too good for Vogue, whereas I thought I definitely wasn't good enough at all for The Guardian, and couldn't really understand why our former colleague and still ongoing friend Ian Katz was letting me sit in the Guardian office. So that's the big separation there.
And you did have the key, though, to the fashion cupboard, where
I had, the cupboard, in control of all the free people and, ethically aware fashion clothes that the Guardian was allowed to borrow.
Of course, no real furs there, all fake and very vegan friendly. So it's wonderful to have you in, as you say, in the chair for this episode of Unholy. Look, we're going to talk about the news, then we're going to do something a little bit different because, as people who are long-time listeners know, the sort of essential ingredient for this podcast is a perspective from outside Israel and a perspective inside Israel. And it's the place where diaspora and Israel meet. I think this may be the first ever episode where there is actually no Israeli in the room, as it were. It's two of us from diaspora, but we thought we would make a virtue of that and actually have a conversation about what life in the Jewish diaspora is like. You're obviously, people can tell from your accent, your roots are in America, but you now live and you've been based in Britain for a long time. So we'll bring that perspective to it. But let's get to the news, because there's been, at least, I think, two really significant things which I wanted just to talk about. I mean, the first is this no from Benjamin Netanyahu to Donald Trump. It's about this 15-point Gaza plan. On the podcast last week with Anshel Pfeffer, we got into some of the detail of that and how Anshel and I were both saying that Netanyahu was really trying to sort of walk a tightrope, thread a needle, choose your cliche, whereby he didn't anger his own coalition partners who do not want to be withdrawing from Gaza. They would see that as a kind of defeat, on the one hand. On the other, he's got Donald Trump, who is now in some ways his only major ally and sort of almost benefactor, who is, under this agreement with Hamas, worked out a deal whereby Hamas disarm, big goal of Netanyahu's, in return for Israeli withdrawal. And until, when Anshel and I spoke, he was still walking this tightrope, and he did this long, convoluted 55-minute video. Since then, Benjamin Netanyahu has come out with this statement saying no. I just wonder, again, partly because you know United States so well, but just what you read into that, what this says about Netanyahu, what this says about Trump, and what it says about this US-Israel relationship, which has been always central, but recently quite fraught.
Well, I think it says mostly that Netanyahu is aware that elections are coming up in 3 months, and Trump is also at this point a lame duck president. I mean, unbelievably, we still have so many years left of him. But Netanyahu's view right now is surely just on the elections. And I don't want to, I'm not generally one to side with Netanyahu here, but I never really did understand the promise that Hamas would disarm. I mean, that was the key part of the plan. And I can understand why Netanyahu's skepticism of that would be there. In terms of Trump, I mean, he is sensing the American turning against of Israel on both sides. Mike Huckabee, as we'll talk about, has become incredibly vocal. And it's not just the progressive left. It is also Republicans now speaking out against Israel. And so both of them are reflecting their bases, really, in this, rather than trying to play with each other. They're more playing with their bases, if that makes sense.
That's interesting. Yeah, that Donald Trump is reacting to the sort of Tucker Carlson
Yeah,
wing of the
absolutely.
Republican movement. Under this deal, which I want to be sort of fair to it, because the Board of Peace, I, among others, criticized it because of its obvious desire to supplant the United Nations and, the fact that it's pay to play. You had to have kind of pay $1 billion to get on the board. We were all very skeptical. There are people who say, look, it's done some serious work here. I think, we reflected some of this last week. It is an actual substantial point. The key thing of this breakthrough was this notion of sequencing, really, that there would be a series of moves on each side, and each would respond to the other. That has been the key that has unlocked past peace agreements. The obvious example, and I think there's a lot of influence of this on this plan, is Northern Ireland, where sequence of measures, and then the climax of it is, in that case, the Irish Republican Army would decommission its weapons. That's the language used here, and it would be a series of steps. But crucial to that was withdrawal. Israel has, in its refusal, has essentially sort of blown a hole in that, because it said, we will only do anything once there is full withdrawal. And I think what the diplomats would say is, that's not how an agreement like this works. It's not like one side gives everything and then the other side finally move. They have to move in this kind of dance. A move here, a move there, a move here, a move there. And maybe, if it wasn't election season, maybe Netanyahu would play ball with that, but he's certainly not doing that now. I mean, in a way, the thing that surprised me about it, I don't know what you think, was the clarity of it, that it was an actual no,
very strong.
Yeah, rather than trying to spin it out.
Yeah, and I think that also, like you say, reflects that we're in election season.
Yeah.
And he's not going to lay himself open to the far right in his country of being weak to America. And he's not letting America tell Israel what to do. Netanyahu is presenting himself, rightly or wrongly, as the strong leader who decides Israel's future, rather than Trump being the deciding king.
Yes, and that is vital. You're right, certainly in terms of an Israeli election. The thing that I think where the Board of Peace thought there might be some movement is between the yellow line that was agreed in the ceasefire and the fact that Israel's gone beyond it. We were hearing last week to a so-called orange line, and the idea was that if they pulled back to the yellow line, the actual thing they'd agreed to in October of 2025, that would count as a concession. But the footwork, the choreography seems to be beyond the participants, and it is a straightforward no. And I think you're completely right to say this is a function of election season. You referred to this other story about Mike Huckabee. So just the background on this. There is this confrontation in the Palestinian village of Qusra, where extremist settlers have essentially dug in the backyard of two Palestinian families who were there on the outskirts of this village, and they won't go. And you and I are speaking in the middle of the day, more or less on Thursday. On Wednesday, there was an attempt by the IDF. They went in, apparently with orders to dismantle this effort and get the extreme settlers out. Didn't happen. They were left empty-handed, as it were. There'd been some footage that people found very shocking of Israeli soldiers praying with these settlers. There was, rather than disciplining them, they are sort of seen to be visually colluding with them. This is a function of the fact that the army is more and more units and now have a strong settler presence. But just there was one thing I was going to say, and then you can tell us about the Mike Huckabee element. The thing I was just going to say is this represents just the bigger picture context is a series of escalations here. So wind all the way back to the settler effort. Settlers, implant themselves in these initially in these 2 or 3 key places that then blossom into. They are now cities. The word settlement can be very misleading. I think people will imagine a few caravans and tents. You go to Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel, Alon Shvut. These are basically towns or cities. And that's where the settlers were, and the Palestinians are in their villages. Then come along so-called hilltop youth, younger extremists, often who plant a few caravans and porter cabins on the little dots on the map. Now it seems the next phase is to go even further and say, why are we allowing all these Palestinian villages to be on the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, as we would call it? We want those too. And what happened at Qusra, it happened in a place called Jalud also 2 or 3 weeks ago, is sort of an encroachment onto the edges of these villages. And these 2 Palestinian families in Qusra are there on the outskirts of the village. And the idea is almost you hold them, you lay siege to their homes. They could leave, but if they leave, they fear they'll never be allowed back. And those homes will then be the first toehold in a settlement. It represents a huge escalation strategically, big picture, of what the settler movement is doing. And they obviously have a big patron in the form of Bezalel Smotrich, who is the relevant minister in charge of settlements in the West Bank. So that, I think, is the big picture. But I think this US intervention is really interesting.
Completely. And again, I think it reflects that Trump and the Republicans are seeing Israel as not a vote winner. Trump doesn't have, I don't feel, a moral compass. He looks for what's going to win him votes from people who will support him. And as he said to Netanyahu a few months ago, you are turning everyone against you. And what he is seeing is that nobody is supporting, the Israel's sort of aggressive Israel movement and the aggressive Netanyahu movement. And the settler movement kind of epitomizes that, the far right, the Smotrich movement. And it just is, as political campaign people say, bad optics. And Mike Huckabee is speaking out against it. He's the American ambassador and being very, very vocal against the settlers. Whether that has any effect, again, because Netanyahu, like I said, is looking to his election rather than America right now, remains to be seen. But it's interesting to see the American right, not just the American left, increasingly turning against at least Netanyahu's Israel.
Yeah, because Huckabee, I want to say tweeted, that dates me, but he went on X and posted denouncing these settler extremists, describing them as, I think, Israeli terrorists. Terrorist is the key word. No, essentially, we've ordered, or we've instructed the Israelis to get the IDF in there and get these Israeli terrorists out. IDF and the police went at our request to remove the Israeli terrorists from the area, said Huckabee. And that prompted in turn a reply from Naftali Bennett, who is, whose star is very much in the descendant. He was the almost designated, challenger to Netanyahu. He's now no longer. And Naftali Bennett responded saying, once again, we are allowing other countries to manage us. This is terrorist activity, and it needs to be condemned, not wait for the Americans to tell us to do it. It goes to that point you were making about Netanyahu.
Yeah, absolutely. Netanyahu at this point looks quite weak from both sides, in the sense, does he wait for America to tell him what to do, or is he being controlled by Smotrich and the far right in his government? And he is making the calculation which is going to get him more votes. And I think he's voting for the far right rather than America.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. He cannot afford to take them on right now. He's looking ahead, as again we talked on the podcast last week. The others are all rivaling for how many votes they get in the Israeli election. He's already assembling his coalition. He's already looking at his coalition partners, and he knows he needs to keep the right. All right. Well, that's the news out of Israel as we see it, and a lot of it, colliding with the outside world and the United States. In fact, both those stories involve the US and Israel, which actually just brings me to the other thing that sort of moves us into this conversation about us, really, Jews in the diaspora. It was an interview that I think both of us found our way to separately, just so unbelievably illuminating. Friend of the podcast, editor of The New Yorker, David Remnick, did an absolutely illuminating revealing interview with Megan Romer, who is co-chair, I think, of the Democratic Socialists of America. They ranged very widely, in which he was really sort of pressing her on the ideology. What does the DSA really stand for? And there was a section on Israel. And I think we'll just hear a bit of it, because I think it gives a flavor of the whole exchange. Let's just hear this, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
Does Israel have the right to defend itself, according to DSA? What is the position that DSA is headed toward here? Is it for a two-state solution? Is it a binational, one-state solution? What in fact is the position of DSA?
Yeah, so our position is a free Palestine with the capital in Jerusalem. And so I think that could be safely read as a one-state solution.
So the Camp David accords that were being negotiated at the beginning of the century under the Clinton administration, had the Palestinians accepted it, that would have satisfied you?
Good question. I need to look at what the actual specifics there were. I don't know them off the top of my head. But so when you say, does Israel have the right to defend itself? Peoples have the right to live in safety. Absolutely. But if that safety means doing genocide to somebody else, then no, that's not defensible.
First of all, I didn't know doing genocide is a verb now. That's the conjugation for it. This is such an interesting and revealing conversation, like you say. First of all, Megan Romer, I looked her up, is in her 40s. So she would, she can remember 2000. And I think it's fascinating that the pro-Palestinian movement in America doesn't seem like many of them, all the ones in their 40s and 30s and older, it doesn't seem to cross their minds to think, I remember vaguely these photos of Arafat with Bill Clinton, and some Israeli guy who I can't remember, from 2000. All of us were looking at the same news. All of us had CNN and the New York Times in 2000. We weren't all atomized like we are now. I vaguely remember those photos. Maybe I should look up what that was. Megan Romer and the DSA really epitomized to me this generation or this sort of way of thinking that believes history began with Twitter. Nothing happened before other than Israel is a colonialist country and that's evil. Nothing else happened. Everything began with Twitter, and they never researched anything that happened before. Do they know that Arafat walked away from that deal? Do they know that Clinton said to him, you are dooming your people by walking away from this deal, because Arafat could not accept any part of Israel being there. He walked away. And the whole interview, like you say, was completely brilliant. It absolutely showed the hollowness of the DSA. And David Remnick, you know him personally. I have interviewed him and talked with him. He is not a gotcha kind of journalist. And if anything, I think the New Yorker has gone too progressive in recent years. So he is not out here to twist Megan Romer. But in that interview with her, he really showed the hollowness of it. All the slogans that they parrot, defund the police, open borders. When he pressed her on those, it turned out they don't mean defund the police. They don't mean open borders. It's all just slogans. And when he presses her on Israel-Palestine, turns out she doesn't know any of the history. She has no concept of what it is, has no concept of what's been tried for before, and has no real concept of what the war is about. It's just that Palestine is saintly, Israel is evil, the end. And I think this is what a lot of us have thought about the far left movement in America and the pro-Palestine movement. Yes, of course, there are people who understand the issues much more deeply and see things maybe differently than I do or you do or whoever. But the vast majority who are out there shouting slogans from the river to the sea, globalize the intifada, have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. And I really do think anybody, before they write intifada on a placard, needs to be able to write the biography of Yasser Arafat. Only then are they allowed to campaign in favor of the intifada.
We both agree on how revealing the whole thing was. The exchange that you pick up on about Camp David, so interesting because, if she'd known about it, she actually could have come back on that and said, Arafat did accept the principle of State of Israel, and the argument ended up being about Jerusalem and the sovereignty there. She would have been able to push back, but she obviously didn't know. And there was something, the word that kept on coming to my mind all the way through was just unserious. That, like the famous Logan Roy line about you're not serious people. At one point, he asks her about tax, and she says, we're going to tax the hell out of millionaires. He goes, okay, well, what does that mean? Put numbers on it. There are no numbers. It was just sort of, and I had to almost go back to just look on my, the episode description to see she's the co-chair. It's not like there's other people who are setting policy and, she's helping at a more junior level. She's the co-chair. So I did think it was unserious. Here's the question I'm interested in, though. It was only one part of their exchange, and yet we know from a whole lot of the other, politics around this, for example, in Michigan, but in other places, how central Israel-Palestine is as a question defining, yes, the DSA, but even just the wider American left. It's a long way away. It's not like they are, steeped in the history, as we heard. Why has it become such a defining issue for the American left. I mean, for example, it was mentioned in that interview that the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, withdrew their endorsement of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who you'd think would be a sort of heroine to them, because at one point she'd voted for a resolution that essentially didn't call for Israel's destruction. Why is it the issue? And, you know, there are plenty of people who say it is the issue of our generation. What's your analysis of why this issue, rather than all the others, is so definitional for the American progressive left?
I have to admit, I see it slightly differently from it being the issue of our generation. I think it is the issue of our generation right now. I don't think it's the only one or has been the only one. And it seems to me that certainly since 2016, the left, you know, young liberals, progressives have wanted to have a civil rights fight, have wanted to find a litmus test to define who's good and who's bad. And for a while, it was the trans issue. That's what we heard about constantly from progressive candidates, including AOC, who spoke out a lot about it and about save trans kids, protect trans kids, et cetera, and how anybody who was against it was a homophobe who was doing conversion therapy. That changed, certainly around October the 7th, but even before then, to being about Israel-Palestine. I think people got tired of the trans argument, and I hope there is a sense of weariness at some point among the sort of not the fanatical fringes, but the sort of the center. There is going to be a weariness about this after a while. And I think we saw that in Wisconsin, for example, this week, when Francesca Hong, who was the DSA candidate, who had spoken a lot about Israel and Palestine and came out with very wacky and cranky comments talking about her mixed race son, who has a white father. She said that gave her proximity to whiteness. That's how she described her motherhood, as having proximity to whiteness, and had spoken out about Israel. And she did not win. And actually, Abdul al-Sayed, who has won in Michigan as the Democrat candidate, he didn't win by as much as people thought. And I think people will get tired of this being the litmus test for the far left. And I actually do think that the DSA, famous last words, I know, but I do think the DSA are not going to be as powerful in 4 years' time as people think they are going to be. In terms of why this one, well, there's a lot of convenient reasons, obviously. This has been built, we've been building up to this on the left for a long time, as you know better than I do, Jonathan. You've been covering it in much more detail than me. But there needed to be a new enemy, a new kind of bogeyman that explains all the evil in the world. And it's interesting that it's both the left and the right, people like Tucker Carlson, have alighted on it being Israel.
If that's right, it's a very, very old bogeyman being resuscitated. But certainly the fact that the left and right have converged on this point again, with both actually often using the language of it as an explainer of the world. In other words, not just confined to the conflict. It's interesting. There's a column which I recommend people should read from Tom Friedman, another friend of the podcast, in the New York Times this week, as a kind of memo of advice to Abdul al-Sayed in Michigan, saying here's how you can win and still really infuriate AIPAC, which is talk about two states, because he says AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, are now in such lockstep with Netanyahu that they're actually, that does not align with them. But it would align with, Jewish Americans, it would align with Palestinian Americans, Muslim Americans, but also it would actually help the conflict itself. And you realize almost there was something about that was slightly out of time, I felt, because I thought to myself as I was reading it, yeah, but you're presuming they're looking for solutions to the actual conflict. In some ways, they're not in that game. They're talking about something bigger, which is, how to explain the world. And that's when you get into kind of global Zionism and so on, rather than the actual conflict that's there and what might be a practical solution. And in a way, we're ending on this when we started, which is, in a way, the ignorance about Camp David is part of that, because it's not actually about, borders and boundaries and security and refugees and right of return. The actual practical stuff of solving this problem, it's almost sort of theological, and it's about, as you said, I think before, it's kind of metaphysical. There's one side is all good and one side is all evil, and one side explains the world we live in. I mean, I'm not saying that about all the people we've talked about, but I think there's some of that animates the right, as you said. and the left. I think this moves us into what I think is we have an opportunity here to discuss, which is, we will be soon in the autumn where we will be looking back at 3 years since October 7. There's going to be a lot of stock taking. I mean, I note it, I have circled in the diary there, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And that's always a period of stock taking on the previous year. But it will be about this period wherein you have written really well and also affectingly about what it's like to be in diaspora in this period. And, even talking about the feelings you have about taking your own children to cheder, to Sunday school, in your Jewish community, and how that has felt as we're not there yet, but as we approach this third anniversary, what's your sort of sense of where we are 3 years on?
Great sadness, really. I do feel that Israel, certainly in the West to a certain extent, is losing the PR war, maybe, if that's an unfortunate way of putting it. I guess I do think people are weary of the mainstream is weary of hearing about Gaza and as well as having sympathy for the Palestinians. But I do feel that people's loyalty or affection, not Jewish, but in the mainstream, feelings about Israel have definitely changed, have definitely darkened over the past 3 years, and certainly in the past year, when we've seen the terrorism against Jews in this country, I think there has been more fear than Jews in this country have known for a long time.
And what about the reaction of our non-Jewish neighbours? I mean, how they've reacted. You mentioned terrorism. Obviously, it's not just been Britain. It's been continental Europe. It was in Canada. It was in Michigan, attacks on synagogues, on Jewish schools. Going back further to just from this spring, Boulder, Colorado, the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington. I mean, you're in touch with both societies, America and here. How do you feel that we know how the Jewish community in a way has been responding, and you've described it, but the response from neighbours and how that's made you feel?
It's fascinating to me how good people are at sifting out facts that don't suit their narrative. The obvious example here, and I know we've talked about this before, Johnny, is when Susan Sarandon said after the Jews were attacked, was it in Pittsburgh? Was it that one?
Yes.
When she said, now Jews know how Muslims feel, as though there had never been attacks on Jews before in America. And I'm sorry to make the obvious point, but if any other minority group had suffered as much terrorism and attacks as Jews have done, as you say, in this country, on the continent, in America, there would be absolute outcry. As it is, there's a slight turning away, a slight sense of awkwardness, a slight feeling of it's complicated, that fantastic phrase. And for Jews to see that over and over again. I was having breakfast with a friend of ours this morning, and he said to me, did people always feel this way about us? Or is it just coming up in the past 3 years where we, any attacks on us, we bring it on ourselves? And the truth is, I don't know. And that's something that I think a lot of us are thinking about.
And when you say it's complicated, do you mean by that the person turning away? And that's quite an image, actually, them turning away. But are they turning away because it's complicated because of Israel? Is that what they mean?
Yes. Yeah, because of Israel. In the same way in America, when, for example, in Hollywood, when there wasn't, I think it was Jerry Seinfeld and other Jewish celebrities had to make various, big Hollywood organizations voice their support of the Jewish community in the wake of the October the 7th attacks, after they'd voiced their support of Palestinians. A slight sense of Israel is the bad guy, therefore this is complicated. If Jews are attacked, it's complicated. This kind of very knee-jerk, simplistic way of thinking. And I think, for me, it's been a surprise how simplistically some people want to see the world.
And you've mentioned a couple of celebrities there. I mean, I didn't say this in the introduction, but one of the things you're professionally, renowned for is as an interviewer of Hollywood stars, celebrities. You have your finger on that particular pulse. I now notice that you can't really get through a celebrity interview without them mentioning this issue. It's partly in a way what was behind me saying before about it's the issue. Palestine is the issue of now.
Yeah.
The celebrities in some ways seem to me quite a good indicator, quite a good sort of bellwether of that. The fact that they feel the need. It always amuses me because it's always framed as being very brave, that they're daring to say this. And the reason why that amuses me is just that it's such a consensus among celebrities. I mean, the exception are the ones who don't say it now. I say this only as a kind of reader of those pieces, that it's there so often that somebody like Laszlo Nemes, the great Hungarian Jewish Hungarian director, I interviewed him a few months ago, and he was putting a very different case. And you realize this is so unusual that you just don't hear anyone in Hollywood or celebrity or close to film ever talking like this. It can be Javier Bardem or whoever. Because you are there, you're often there, rather in Hollywood and LA. You see these people. Just explain to us what you think's going on there.
I mean, just when you were talking about how it's framed as this being brave, and they all say it. It reminded me of that great phrase that our friend Jeffrey Goldberg, who's the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, says. He calls it the taboo that won't shut up, which always makes me laugh. Yes, and again, I don't think they're the same. I'm not conflating the trans rights movement with the Palestinian rights movement, although obviously there are overlaps. The difference, of course, is that the anti-Israel movement attracts the right and the left, which that didn't happen on the trans movement as much, if at all. But what I did notice because I covered the Oscars most years, is there was this amazing shift pre-COVID when all of them were wearing a little trans rights, the trans flag badge. And then after COVID, not all of them, but a lot of them, people like Javier Bardem and Mark Ruffalo, those kinds of people were wearing the bloodied hand badge. And it suddenly was very much anti-Israel. The badges had switched. And of course, I say this as someone who interviews celebrities a lot. We can't take them too seriously. They're generally idiots. Actors are people who have to be told what to say for a job. But it is what's voguish and what's cool. And the most interesting celebrity story to emerge from all this for me is Jerry Seinfeld, someone who I've always admired as a comedian, but didn't think about him personally. He seemed to me, if anything, quite middle of the road, bland American dad. And he has been incredibly vocal about this in support of Israel and against Hamas, to the point that his shows are now picketed by pro-Palestinian protesters. And he walks through them and laughs at them. And there was a clip recently of him walking through a crowd and someone shouting out to him saying, say free Palestine, Jerry, say free Palestine. And he looked at the guy and laughed and said, there's no such place. And I thought, quite bold. And I don't think I'm, revealing anything, but I was at an event covering it in New York, and he was there, and he'd just come back from Israel with his wife, where they had been there when some of the hostages had been released, some of the October 7th hostages. He'd gone there for this. And I just sort of imagine coming out of a Hamas jail and there's Jerry Seinfeld. You'd think he would have been hit over the head. But he is very vocal about this in a way I never, ever could have imagined, and doesn't care how it's trashed his reputation. I mean, in a sense, he is the pro-Israel's J.K. Rowling, in the same way J.K. Rowling was willing to, give up her capital in support of women's rights against the trans rights movement. Jerry Seinfeld has done the same for the pro-Zionist movement against the pro-Palestinian protesters.
I mean, that the story I thought you were going to say was the one where he's heckled in a crowd by an anti-Israel protester and says, you're in the show. It means you've given money to a Jew. You can't feel good about that. That's not a win for you, he said. But the story you've told is interesting, and in a way I think it dispirits me a little bit, just because it tells me about the polarization that's happened, because him saying there's no such place, when I was as a Washington correspondent in the 90s, it was in the period of Oslo, second reference for Yasser Arafat in this episode, but it became de rigueur on the mantelpiece of every self-respecting Jewish philanthropist. They would have a picture of themselves, yes, with the Israeli Prime Minister, but they would have a picture of themselves with Yasser Arafat. It became de rigueur because they'd been at the big dinner of the whatever Jewish charity it was, Israel Charity, and it became a thing that you would meet Rabin, you would meet Arafat, the handshake. These two sides were going to make peace. It showed you'd been present at the signing on the White House lawn if you're a big giver to the Democrats. You know, they were not people saying there's no such place then.
No,
but what's happened in the post-October 7 period and this this surge in anti-Semitism is it's forced people back into corners. And I think somebody like Jerry Seinfeld would not have been in that place, but he's in some ways been driven there by by people heckling his show, by that turning away that you described. I think it saddens me because I think we need mainstream opinion to be in a different place on whether or not there is a Palestine and there's Palestinians and they have a right to a state. But I can completely see how we've got to this point. The elections are coming in Israel. A question I've been asked a few times is what impact they're going to have on us, and us here meaning diaspora Jews. I've got my own thoughts on it, but you go first.
No, I want to hear your thoughts, actually, Johnny, because my thoughts are so pessimistic that I feel they'd just be a downer. Do you have optimistic thoughts on this?
Well, I'm not in the predictions business anymore. 2016 cured me of that particular malady, and after Trump and Brexit, you won't get any predictions out of me. No, I'm not predicting the outcome. The thoughts I have on it is, were there to be a change, and I'm certainly not holding my breath or betting on that, but were there to be a change, I think it would be profound in its impact on the diaspora, partly because of what we were talking about earlier, which is the lack of knowledge about this conflict. Netanyahu is such a sort of avatar symbol as a hate figure. That he's had it's much stronger. I was going to say like Orban or Trump or someone, actually much more than certainly Orban, who most people couldn't pick out of a lineup. But Netanyahu's face is there. It's totemic. I would say, after Trump, the best known and probably most hated world leader. And that means there's just no, your comment before about when you say that, well, there was a synagogue attacked and people go, it's complicated. It's partly because there's this hated figure there. And if there's someone else there, at least there's some space. There's an opening to say, look, the Israeli public rejected Netanyahu. Therefore, if you're like many diaspora Jews, if you are, you feel connected to the people of Israel, that is very different from feeling like an ally of Netanyahu. These are different things. That suddenly becomes very clear and understandable if Israelis have turfed Netanyahu out. But also, and again, there's a bit of optimism thrown in here, I do believe that almost any other leader other than Netanyahu would go through the process that other Israeli prime ministers have gone through, which is to think, okay, we have to actually deal with the underlying thing here. It happened to Ehud Olmert, formerly of Likud. It happened to Naftali Bennett, formerly of Likud, less so with him. It happened to Ariel Sharon, famously. And I think that I can believe that about an Eisenkot, Gadi Eisenkot, the leading rival to Netanyahu. It's clearly not going to happen with Netanyahu. He's just so dug in, 76-year-old, he's not going to move anymore. So those are the two reasons why I think it would be huge change, but you're more pessimistic.
Yeah, I just feel that the argument in the past 3 years has gone so far from the problem is Netanyahu and the treatment of the Palestinians to the existence of Israel, full stop. Zionism is now seen as basically analogous with fascism. And I think the overall PR of, for Israel, that's a terrible way of putting it, but the overall perception of Israel for a lot of people is now, this is this evil colonialist enterprise. Not that they know anything about the history of 1947, 48, nothing. They just have this idea of evil Western Jews coming from, suddenly deciding to kick Palestinians out of their homes and take their country, and how evil that is. I mean, that is the image.
And your feeling is, even if it's not Netanyahu there, that feeling persists?
I feel that people who follow the news and are thoughtful, and of course these people do exist, but in terms of the crowds, the majority, people who just, hear things online and people who just, don't have time to read the news, and I understand that, just now have this very strong idea that Israel is this colonialist country of white people in the middle of the Middle East and oppresses the innocent, humble brown people in surrounding countries. That has been the image. And, too many media organizations that should know better have gone along with it and endorsed it and promoted it. And people like simple narratives. They like good and evil. That's why Marvel movies are so popular. And Israel is very much evil. And I find it shocking. I hardly need to be telling you or Unholy listeners, I find it shocking. People have no interest in the history of leading up to Israel. What happened 1947, 48, all of that, 1967, they have no interest. They just see it as white people kicking brown people out of their homes.
I mean,
that's it.
As if in support of that point, there was a column written by Mehdi Hassan, British-born but now very successful media figure in the United States. His closing line was, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." And his argument was, it doesn't matter who replaces Netanyahu. All of them are as bad and will make no difference. And I did note that that was a shift, because there was a time when people outside, even very much on the left, would be rooting for Netanyahu to lose, but hoping that Ehud Barak or whichever challenger would take his place, because that would be then a prospect of a reopened peace process and so on. And I thought, if you're already saying, even to Yair Golan, who's really on the far left of the mainstream spectrum inside Israel, who has said some really strong and radical things and does talk about two states for two peoples, he was put in the same category as if he was no different from Netanyahu. And I thought, okay, that goes to your point, that it doesn't matter who the face is at the top. It doesn't matter. There's going to be the feeling the current opposition persists. Before we leave this, just because we mentioned that piece you wrote about your own kids and going to sort of nursery school or cheder or whatever it was. Have you changed any part of your kind of practice because of this? This is something I'm asking lots of diaspora Jews. There's people who used to wear a Magen David, a Star of David, on the outside and now tuck it and wear it on the inside. These sorts of things. Because you had written publicly about your, the feeling about taking your kids to Sunday school, to cheder. Has any part of it changed?
No, other than I'm more emphatic about they have to go. So I've got twins who are going through exams next year, and they're already trying to use this as an excuse not to go to cheder on the weekends to revise. And I've said to them, Hebrew school does not trump normal school. I'm afraid you're going to just have to study 7 days a week. So no, I've become more emphatic about it. I want them to have a very strong sense of Jewish identity. They don't go to Jewish schools here, so I think it's very important for them to have it outside. But I never wore, I didn't have, a Star of David or a High or anything like that. And maybe I should have. Actually, one of my boys now insists on wearing his kippah when we go to shul. So he's become much more demonstrative about it. But that's it. No, it hasn't changed, other than I'm very strict about we have to go to synagogue on all the high holy days and on Saturdays.
Yeah. No, that is notable. Now, Yonit is not here, but she had a question for both of us to ponder, which is whether or not we think there is a sort of leader in the diaspora. In other words, somebody who speaks for diaspora Jews. I immediately thought, no, there isn't. I'm struck by your mention before of Jerry Seinfeld, but I mean, do we have such a person, we diaspora Jews? Is there anybody even comes to mind?
Well, obviously, this podcast is the first thing that comes to mind.
You can come back, Hadley. If you're going to say that, you're going to come back.
There's just too much, have two Jews in a room and have three opinions. There's just too much diversity of opinion.
Yeah.
There used to be, before October the 7th, I would have said in this country someone like Howard Jacobson. And now I feel he's very much on the outs with a lot of people, including, a lot of Jews on the left in this country. So I think the range of opinion is too great. We go to where someone makes sense to us, which is why I come to Unholy.
That's a perfect segue, tribute, but also segue into an unholy tradition, which is our awards. You obviously are first in the list for a Mensch nomination because of coming on the podcast and for what you've said. But why don't you have, I've got a Mensch nominee up my sleeve. Why don't you come up with a suggestion for our Chutzpah award this week?
Well, I am torn. I've got two, actually, if that's not too cheeky.
No, it's always a crowded field, this one, in our world.
Well, I worry this is punching down a little bit, but I have to say the images of Greta Thunberg at the Kneecap concert in Belfast this week, wearing a keffiyeh and a balaclava, a provost balaclava, to me just kind of summed up the inanity of the progressive left at this point. You know, I feel for Greta. She was too famous, too young. I'm sure she has things going on in her life that I cannot imagine. But to be actively promoting groups that commit terrorism is something I cannot imagine. And she posed in front of various photos of IRA terrorists and Palestinian terrorists from the past very proudly on this tour of Belfast. That also touches on Ireland's very strange attitude towards Israel. And it just was nauseating. And she is a figurehead, and that I think it should be called out.
Yeah, I haven't seen those pictures. I will now go and look for them. But one thing I'm just struck by is as the whole of Europe is burning with this, so obviously a result of the climate crisis. And she seems to speak about the environment much, much less now, and instead about these other issues, and yet actually the cause of climate breakdown could not be more urgent.
Absolutely.
But a strong nomination from you for our Chutzpah award. I wanted to go a little bit different with our Mensch award. It comes via Australia. It is the Bashevis Singers. Now, they had me at that name. It is a troupe of three musicians who put Yiddish poetry to music and have called themselves the Bashevis Singers in homage, of course, to the great Nobel laureate and Yiddish novelist Isaac Bashevis Singer. I think that's a brilliant name for a choral group. But in this case, they have a new album out called Moon's Milk. It is comprised of, the lyrics are all from the nature poems of Avraham Sutzkever, who was described as perhaps the greatest Yiddish poet of the 20th century. It's quite a story because he died in 2010 in Israel, where he had lived since 1948. People don't often associate Israel with Yiddish. He continued writing in Yiddish. He had almost no profile there, partly because of the country's attitude to Yiddish, which was Yiddish is the language of the past and of diaspora in a way of weakness, and Hebrew is the language of the future and Israel and strength. So there were not many takers for Avraham Sutzkever in Israel. Nevertheless, he continued writing in Yiddish and now gets this recognition. The Bashevis Singers, a troupe of three musicians, have put to his poetry to music. Now, this was sent to me, and I thought, okay, I had an image of what it would sound like. It is absolutely transportingly beautiful. It is. I've been listening to it more or less on a loop for the last 48 hours. It is fantastically beautiful. So our Mensch of the week is the Bashevis Singers for a great name, but also for reviving what may have been a forgotten poet otherwise, and for proving that Yiddish doesn't have to be the sound of the old world, because this sounds very current and very beautiful. Our thank yous to Michal Porat for producing, and of course, especially to you, Hadley, for being such a game, unholy co-host.